They say if you drop a frog into boiling water, it jumps out, but if you place it in cool water and slowly raise the temperature, it will sit there until it dies. I used to think that was just a grotesque old wives' tale. But now I realize I was the frog, and my life was the pot. I just didn't notice the heat until it was too late. My name is Caroline. I'm 25 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I had the kind of family that Hallmark movies were made about: modest, stable, unshakably ordinary in the best possible way. We lived in a 3-bedroom ranch in a sleepy Midwestern town where the biggest scandal was a squirrel knocking over someone's Halloween decorations. Our lawn was always trimmed. Our Sunday dinners never missed a beat. Our family photo hung in a wooden frame above the fireplace, everyone smiling, shoulders touching, like something out of a brochure. My dad, Richard, was a high school history teacher with a laugh that could fill an entire room. He wore polos tucked into faded jeans, always smelled faintly of pine and chalk dust, and had this way of turning any mundane moment into a mini-adventure. He called me his sidekick, a nickname that started when I was 5 and used to trail after him in the garden, asking questions about worms and weeds. "Every explorer needs a sidekick," he used to say, tousling my hair, handing me a tiny spade, and letting me dig like I was discovering buried treasure. My mom, Anne, was quieter. A former nurse who now spent most of her time baking for church events or folding laundry with the kind of precision you'd expect from a military base. She was polite to a fault, never raised her voice, and always seemed to disappear into the background, like wallpaper you'd grown used to. She wasn't cold, exactly, just reserved. I didn't notice it as a child because I didn't know anything different. She loved us in her way: quiet dinners, neatly made beds, and warm casseroles. Love by routine. Then there was my older brother, Evan, dependable, composed, always slightly out of reach. He was 4 years older, which meant by the time I hit middle school, he was already orbiting in a completely different world. We didn't fight, and we didn't bond. We existed side by side like parallel train tracks, close, yet never touching. Looking back now, I realize the first hairline crack appeared when I was 8. It was a Sunday afternoon, one of those golden September days that smells like fresh-cut grass and apple cider. We were at church, lingering in the courtyard while grown-ups made small talk and kids ran around like released balloons. A woman I didn't recognize approached my mom with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, "Caroline's adorable. She really doesn't look like either of you, does she?" My mom froze. Not visibly, not in any way you'd catch if you weren't watching, but I saw it. Her fingers tightened slightly on her purse strap. Her smile grew just a touch more rigid. "Takes after her great-grandmother," she replied quickly, before steering me toward the car like we were late for something. I didn't understand it at the time, but that moment lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. There were other moments like that, tiny, strange things that should have meant nothing. One summer night, I woke up to the sound of my parents arguing in the kitchen. I didn't hear everything, but I caught my name. I caught not telling her, and "it's better this way." The next morning, they acted like nothing happened, but my mom wouldn't look me in the eye during breakfast, and my dad offered to take me to the hardware store even though we didn't need anything. But mostly, things were quiet, and good, and normal. I loved school. I joined the swim team. I got a part-time job at the local bookstore. Dad helped me with my college essays, sitting with me at the kitchen table while my mom baked banana bread in the background like some domestic soundtrack. When I got the scholarship letter from Indiana University, my dad lifted me off the ground in a hug, spinning me around like I was 6 years old again. I moved out that August with 2 suitcases, a fan, and the belief that my life was exactly what it should be. I kept in touch with my parents regularly, came home for the holidays, and always found my dad waiting at the station with a paper cup of my favorite gas station hot chocolate. It was our thing. College flew by in a blur of exams, internships, and one unforgettable roommate who insisted on performing fire poi on the dorm lawn. I met Mark during sophomore year, all shy smiles and nervous jokes and an encyclopedic knowledge of 90s rom-coms. He was the first person I ever dated seriously, and by the time we graduated, we were talking rings and apartment leases. Graduation day was perfect, blue skies, slightly too warm, the air buzzing with nerves and excitement. My parents were there, clapping the loudest when my name was called. After the ceremony, my dad pulled me aside and handed me an envelope. His hands were shaking. "I wrote this the night you were born," he said. "I didn't know when you'd be ready to read it, but I think now's the time." I opened it that night in the tiny apartment Mark and I were moving into together. The handwriting was uneven, raw. My father had written about the first time he held me, how he had never felt so terrified and awed in his entire life. He wrote about my first cry, about how he promised to never let me feel alone, about how I would always be his girl. I cried so hard my chest ached. I thought, this is love. This is what it means to be safe. A year later, Mark and I got married in a small ceremony under a sycamore tree. Dad walked me down the aisle with tears in his eyes. Mom dabbed hers with a tissue and nodded approvingly at the understated floral arrangements. Everything was right. When we decided to start trying for a baby, our doctor suggested genetic counseling, just to rule out hereditary conditions. It felt routine, almost boring, like filling out a long form at the DMV. The counselor was warm, professional, a woman named Dr. Klein with bright red glasses and a voice like a lullaby. We gave saliva samples, chatted about family history, and scheduled a follow-up. 2 weeks later, Dr. Klein called and asked me to come in alone. She said it was probably nothing, just a clarification, but her voice had a strange lilt, polite but tight, like something held back. That's when the pot began to boil. That's when the heat finally reached me. I had never been afraid of medical paperwork before. I filled it out like breathing, checkboxes, signatures, routine disclosures about allergies and family history. But the genetic testing form I stared at that morning felt different, like a loaded weapon disguised as a clipboard. It wasn't just asking about health, it was quietly preparing to unravel the scaffolding of my entire life. Mark sat beside me in the exam room, holding my hand as the nurse returned with 2 clear tubes and a gentle smile. Just some saliva, she said, like we were about to do a magic trick. We'll run ancestry and markers for common hereditary conditions. Totally standard, nothing to worry about. It wasn't until we left the clinic that a strange, vague sense of dread settled in my chest, not panic exactly, but the low, buzzing static that precedes a storm. I told myself it was just nerves about trying to get pregnant. Everyone felt this way, didn't they? It was a big step, a responsible one. Mark kissed the top of my head and suggested brunch. I nodded, but something about the sun felt off that morning. Too warm for October, too cheerful for how unsettled I suddenly felt inside. 3 weeks later, the results arrived via a password-protected email. I remember the moment perfectly because I had just come in from the garden with dirt under my fingernails and a basil sprig in my pocket. I clicked the link absently, sipping lukewarm tea. The first page loaded slowly, pie charts, percentages, colorful heritage bubbles. I scanned it without much thought, until I realized something strange. There was no mention of German ancestry. None. Not a single drop. My father, Richard, had traced our lineage back to 1700s Bavaria with the enthusiasm of a man cataloging buried treasure. Every Christmas, he brought out a faded family tree, reverently pointing to names that sounded like classical composers. But according to this test, I was almost entirely of Scottish and French origin. No German. No Eastern European trace. Just rows of unfamiliar history, staring back like a stranger's reflection. I blinked, refreshed the page, and clicked on the Close Relatives tab. Mark's name appeared, as expected, but that was it. No parent match, Richard, or parent match, Anne. In fact, it said clearly, no immediate parental matches found. At first, I laughed. Actually laughed. Some kind of glitch, I thought. Maybe they mismatched the barcode or swapped my tube with someone else's. The idea that I might not be biologically related to the 2 people who raised me, who named me, fed me, loved me, was too absurd to entertain seriously. I ordered a second test from a different service within the hour. I told no one. Not even Mark. Not yet. While I waited, I did what I always do when something gnaws at my peace. I researched. I buried myself in forums, articles, and genetic counseling journals, reading about cases of false paternity and non-parental events like I was studying for an exam that would determine my ability to keep breathing. Most people discovering family secrets through DNA testing used phrases like identity crisis, emotional earthquake, or soul-level confusion. I read those descriptions with growing discomfort because even though I wasn't sure yet, even though the second test hadn't returned, my bones were already whispering that something was terribly wrong. 2 weeks later, the second report arrived with eerie punctuality. This time, I was ready. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, phone turned off, and my heart thudding like a drum inside a metal chest. I clicked through the tabs methodically, hoping for reassurance, fearing confirmation. And there it was again, no genetic link to either Richard or Anne. No half match. No question. I stared at the screen for over an hour, rereading the results, hoping some new detail would appear, something that would make this make sense. Instead, it only grew starker with repetition. My DNA did not match the people I had called my parents my entire life. Still clinging to scraps of denial, I remembered that Evan, my older brother, had done one of those ancestry kits years ago for fun. He even posted the screenshot on Facebook once, boasting about being 48% German and some trace Scandinavian. I messaged him casually, asking if he still had access to his account. Sure, he replied. Want me to invite you to the family tree? Kind of weird, but okay. When I clicked into his profile and uploaded my data for comparison, the final door slammed shut. Evan was a perfect genetic match to Richard and Anne. Full sibling match. Classic inheritance patterns. The whole package. But I wasn't in the tree. Not even a hint of overlap. Not a cousin. Not a half-sibling. I was invisible. The next few days passed in a haze of mechanical tasks. Feeding the dog, answering emails, pretending to laugh at Mark's jokes. But inside, I was spiraling like a ghost trapped in a photo frame. I replayed memories on a constant loop, trying to find the moment where the truth had slipped through the cracks. I saw my mother's tense smile when someone said I didn't look like her. I heard the muffled voices behind their bedroom door that night when I was 10, not telling her, and, it's better this way. I saw Evan's face during family dinners, polite but distant, like he was always holding something back. The tipping point came in the form of a flashback so vivid I nearly dropped a glass. I was 15, standing in front of the bathroom mirror after school, brushing my hair. My mom passed behind me and said absently, "Your eyes are getting darker. You're starting to look different." She never finished the sentence, but I remember how odd it felt at the time. Now it hit like a freight train, she knew. I didn't tell Mark right away because part of me was still trying to manage the fallout in silence, like mopping up a flood with paper towels. But after 3 days of hiding in the guest room under the guise of spring cleaning, he finally cornered me with a plate of scrambled eggs and the gentlest voice. "Caroline, what's going on? You're scaring me." So I told him everything. From the DNA test to the second confirmation to Evan's family tree. His face went through phases: confusion, disbelief, and finally, something close to grief. "What are you going to do?" he asked, reaching across the table. "I don't know," I whispered, and for the first time in days, I let myself cry. Not the silent, dignified tears I was used to. This was full-body grief, ugly, gasping sobs for a self that might not exist anymore. That weekend, I drove back to my childhood home without calling first. It was a cold, gray morning, the kind of sky that seemed to apologize for existing. My mom answered the door in her usual soft cardigan and slippers, surprised but not unwelcoming. "Caroline," she said, blinking. "Is everything okay?" "No," I said simply. "Can we talk?" She led me to the kitchen, poured coffee like we were discussing weather, and sat across from me at the table I'd grown up eating spaghetti and birthday cake at. "I need to ask you something," I began, my voice shaking. "And I need you to be completely honest." She didn't interrupt, didn't even blink, just waited. "Am I adopted?" The word hung in the air like smoke from a candle just snuffed out. For a moment, she said nothing. Then her shoulders sagged, and I watched something in her face collapse. "No," she whispered. "Not officially. But, yes." My breath caught. "What does that mean?" "Not officially." She folded her hands tightly, knuckles white. "You were mine, Caroline, from the moment I knew I was pregnant. But, Richard isn't your father." The room spun slightly. I gripped the edge of the table like it might save me from falling through the floor. "What?" She began to cry, not loud, not dramatic, just soft tears sliding down cheeks that had always seemed too composed for sorrow. "It was a mistake," she said. "A terrible, terrible mistake. I had a brief affair. Just a few months. It was stupid, and I ended it before I even found out I was pregnant." She told me she panicked when she missed her period. That DNA tests weren't available back then like they are now. That Richard had just assumed the baby was his, and she let him. That they'd been trying for over a year, and when she told him the news, he cried with joy. "I couldn't take it from him," she said, her voice breaking. "I couldn't undo that moment." "So you lied," I said quietly. "For 30 years, you lied." "I thought it would never matter," she whispered. "We raised you. We loved you. He adores you. Nothing about that is a lie." But it felt like a lie. Every birthday, every bedtime story, every time he called me his sidekick, all of it was now suspended in a terrifying ambiguity. Did it still count if it was built on a false foundation? Did love survive when the truth didn't? "I don't know who I am anymore," I said, standing up too quickly. My chair scraped against the tile, loud and unforgiving. "I don't know what to do with this." My mother stood too, reaching out, but I stepped back. "Does Dad know?" I asked. She shook her head. "Never. He never suspected. And now, he's not well. his memories going, his heart. So that was the final blow. The decision I never wanted to face. Do I tell the man who raised me, the man who loved me without question, that the foundation of our entire relationship was a lie? Or do I protect him from a truth that can't be undone? I left without hugging her. That night, I sat on the floor of our living room, holding the letter he'd written me the night I was born. I read it again, every shaky word, every promise, every ounce of unfiltered love. I pressed it to my chest and cried for the girl I had been, the woman I was, and the truth that might never feel clean. And I still haven't told him. I used to believe that truth was inherently redemptive, that if you laid it bare, no matter how painful, it would purify the air and bring clarity to all the tangled shadows in a room. But I understand now that some truths don't cleanse. Some truths are bombs. You don't get catharsis. You just get wreckage. It took me almost a month to make the decision. 30 sleepless nights, too many glasses of wine, and a stack of torn-up letters I had tried to write to my father. I told myself that Richard deserved to know the truth, not just because of the moral weight of it, but because I had never kept anything from him before. He was my person. My compass. If I couldn't be honest with him now, then who exactly was I preserving? A childlike version of myself that no longer existed? Mark warned me gently that it might do more harm than good. He's not well, he reminded me, more than once. You might be lighting a fire you can't put out. But I had already lit the match by asking questions in the first place. There was no turning back. There was only forward, even if it led straight into the storm. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when I finally drove to the assisted living center where my father had moved after his third cardiac episode. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and bland casserole. I passed the receptionist with a tight smile and found him in the common room, half watching a rerun of Bonanza. His face lit up when he saw me, that familiar warmth, undimmed even by age or illness. "Hey, kiddo," he said, patting the seat beside him. "You bring any of that banana bread?" I sat down slowly, wishing with everything in me that I could hand him a dessert instead of the words burning a hole in my chest. "Not today, Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to talk to you. About something serious." He blinked, instantly alert. "Everything okay with the kids? Mark? You?" "It's not about them. It's about me. And you. And Mom." I told him everything, not all at once, but in a quiet, measured sequence that I had rehearsed 100 times. The DNA test, the confirmation from Evan's results, the conversation with Mom, her admission that she'd had an affair, that she'd been pregnant, that she let him believe I was his child because it was easier than telling the truth. At first, he stared at me like I had spoken a different language. Then he laughed, short, dry, and completely hollow. "That's not possible," he said, shaking his head. "You're my daughter." "I thought so too," I said softly. "But the science, it's not wrong." He pushed himself out of the chair with a kind of rage I had never seen in him before. "So what are you saying?" he barked. "That I've been a fool? That everything I built my life around was fake?" "No," I whispered. "I'm saying you still raised me. You're still my dad. That hasn't changed." "But it has," he snapped, pacing to the window. "If you're not mine, then what the hell are we?" Those words landed like a slap. "If you're not mine, then what the hell are we?" My knees went weak. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab his hands and make him remember every bedtime story, every school project, every road trip where he let me pick the music. But he wouldn't meet my eyes. His back was stiff, and his voice was cold when he finally spoke again. "I need time to think. You should go." That night, I lay awake replaying the moment over and over, hoping I had misheard the venom in his voice. But the silence that followed in the coming days confirmed what I feared. He didn't call. He didn't text. When I reached out, I was met with vague messages from the facility staff about needing space, feeling tired, and requesting no visitors. When he finally called a month later, his voice was thinner, more brittle. "I want you to hear this from me," he said. "I'm rewriting my will. Evan will be handling things moving forward. It's just simpler that way." My throat tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means this has changed things," he said. "Every time I see you, all I can think about is your mother's betrayal. I'm sorry. I'm not angry at you. But I can't. I can't look at you the same way." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I thanked him for the call and hung up like someone scheduling a dentist appointment. Then I walked into the bathroom, locked the door, and sobbed until my ribs hurt. It wasn't just grief. It was the unmaking of a bond one had believed to be unbreakable, a kind of death that happened while both people were still alive. My mother, meanwhile, had stopped pretending everything was okay. She stopped going to church, stopped cooking, spent most of her days in her bedroom, curtains drawn, alternating between denial and weeping apologies. I was scared, she kept saying. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But it had. And now we were all choking on the smoke of a fire she'd started 40 years ago and never bothered to put out. Evan was the final blow. I had assumed, perhaps naively, that he would be the rational one, the diplomat. Instead, he called me one evening with a voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded. "Why would you tell Dad? What did you think it would fix?" "He deserved to know," I said quietly. "No, he didn't," Evan hissed. "He deserved peace. He deserved the last few years of his life without this humiliation." I wanted to argue, to tell him that living a lie isn't peace, but I could hear it in his voice. He wasn't going to listen. "He doesn't even want to see you anymore," Evan continued. "You've broken something that can't be put back together." I hung up before I said something unforgivable. Then I sat in the dark for a long time, staring at nothing. Mark found me there an hour later, and for once, even his gentle touch couldn't reach me. I had never felt more alone. My own children, Emily and Ryan, were supportive in the ways that kids often are. They hugged me tighter, drew me pictures, made me tea without asking. But they didn't understand the magnitude of what I had lost, and I didn't have the words to explain it to them. How do you describe the sensation of discovering that your foundation was sand, and that every memory you once held sacred is now suspect? I became a ghost in my own life. I showed up to work. I attended school concerts. I smiled at neighbors. But inside, I was hollow. Every time I passed a mirror, I saw someone I didn't recognize, not because of age or time, but because the identity I had clung to for decades had been stripped away, leaving nothing but raw questions. Had he ever loved me? Or had he only loved the version of me that fit into his narrative? Was our bond real, or just a very convincing imitation? The worst part wasn't his rejection. It was the realization that the warmth I remembered might never have been mine to begin with, that I had been an unwitting actor in someone else's story. 3 months later, I got the call while I was making dinner. Richard had suffered a massive stroke in his sleep. He never regained consciousness. He died 2 days later, surrounded by nurses and staff, but not by me. His obituary came out that weekend. A full column in the local paper. They called him a beloved teacher, a husband, a father of one. My name wasn't mentioned. Not even a footnote. It was like I had never existed. At the funeral, I sat in the back row, dressed in muted gray. Evan gave the eulogy, standing tall and composed at the podium. He talked about Richard's love of history, his passion for teaching, his unwavering dedication to his family. Every word stabbed. Every silence between them hurt more. My mother sat near the front, eyes vacant, lips trembling. I didn't approach her. I didn't trust myself not to scream. After the service, as mourners filtered past the casket, I waited until the church was nearly empty. Then I stood alone in front of the man who had raised me and said nothing. No grand declaration. No apologies. Just a silent goodbye between the girl who had once been his sidekick and the man who had chosen to forget her. I left a single folded piece of paper on the casket, his letter, the one he wrote the night I was born. I didn't need it anymore. It wasn't mine to keep. Grief, as it turns out, does not always arrive as a storm. Sometimes it settles in like fog, thick, slow, and disorienting, until one day you realize you've been walking in circles, unsure of what direction you're heading or if you're moving at all. For months after the funeral, I existed in that fog, performing the rituals of daily life without the conviction of presence. I cooked meals without tasting them, responded to my children with automatic affection, and lay beside my husband at night while feeling a mile away. It was Mark who gently suggested therapy. He didn't frame it as a fix or a critique, but rather as a space, one that belonged only to me, where I wouldn't need to pretend. I resisted at first, mostly out of habit. I had always been the one people leaned on. I was the helper, the planner, the reliable one who held everything together. Admitting that I needed help felt like unraveling a thread I wasn't sure I could wind back in. But I went. The therapist's office was warm, softly lit, with bookshelves full of titles I had never heard of and cushions in calming tones of sage and cream. Her name was Meredith, and she had a way of sitting still that made silence feel like an invitation instead of an awkward pause. On the first day, I told her I wasn't sure where to begin. She smiled and said, "Begin where it still hurts." So I began with Richard. With the letter he wrote me when I was born. With the betrayal he felt. With the hollow silence that had replaced a lifetime of love. I told her about the funeral, how he had chosen to erase me from the narrative of his life, as if I were a footnote that no longer fit the storyline. Meredith listened without interruption, only occasionally nodding or offering a short prompt that invited me deeper. After several sessions, she said something that stuck in my chest like a seed planting itself into fertile soil. Love given is not undone by what comes after. The affection, the years, the memories, they remain yours. He may have rewritten the ending, but he does not own your beginning. I returned to that sentence often, like a mantra. It was the beginning of understanding something I had not dared to admit, that even if Richard died estranged from me, even if his obituary denied my existence, the man who once let me fall asleep on his chest during thunderstorms was not an illusion. That love had been real. Complicated, yes. Flawed, certainly. But real. 2 months later, I received a phone call from the manager of Richard's assisted living facility. She spoke with quiet compassion and told me they were packing up the last of his belongings. There was a sealed envelope with my name on it. No return address. No markings beyond my first name in his unmistakable handwriting. I drove there alone, my palms damp against the steering wheel, my chest tight with apprehension. I told myself it could be anything: instructions for a forgotten account, a poem, or a last jab from a man who had stopped seeing me as his. Instead, I found a letter, short, almost clinical in tone, but undeniably his. Caroline. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if I'll have the courage to send it. But I want to say this plainly, because you deserve that at least. I never stopped loving you. I want to be clear about that. My distance wasn't about you, it was about me. I didn't know how to look at you without feeling the weight of everything I didn't see. Everything I didn't ask. Everything your mother didn't tell me. That betrayal wasn't yours, but I wore it like it was carved into my skin. That wasn't fair to you. You are, my daughter in every way that ever mattered. I just didn't have the strength to hold that truth next to the pain. I'm sorry for that. I hope one day you can forgive the way I left things. Dad. I read it sitting in my car, windows rolled down, the late spring wind brushing my face like a hand I once knew. I didn't cry, not then. The tears came later, after I read it again at home, after I held the letter against my chest like it could bring him back. It didn't absolve everything. It didn't heal the wounds or erase the obituary or fill the space he had carved out by pushing me away. But it gave me something I hadn't realized I needed, a place to put the pain, and permission to call our love real even if the ending wasn't the one I deserved. It was also around that time that I reached out to James, my biological father. His name had come up in one of the more detailed results from the DNA testing site, listed as a likely parent match, with enough data points to confirm the near impossible. I had hesitated for weeks before sending the message, unsure of what I even wanted from him: connection, answers, curiosity, or perhaps just a final missing piece of a puzzle that had defined too many sleepless nights. His response was swift, respectful, and cautious. He had never known about me, he wrote. He was shocked, of course. He had been a professor of political science, now retired and living alone in Vermont. We exchanged several emails, then a few phone calls, each one more surreal than the last. Eventually, I drove out to meet him. James greeted me with a tentative smile and a pot of coffee already brewing. He was taller than I expected, with eyes like mine and a nervous energy that reminded me of Evan, strangely enough. Our first conversation was awkward, careful and full of potholes, as we danced around the enormity of what connected us. But he was kind, thoughtful, unfailingly honest. He had never married, never had other children, and seemed genuinely floored by the idea that he had a daughter, let alone grandchildren. And yet, as we sat together on his porch, overlooking a garden he clearly loved, I felt a strange detachment. He was a good man, I could see that. But he was not my father, not in the way that mattered. He was DNA. Biology. An origin point. But he did not know the smell of my childhood room, the way I cried when I lost my first tooth, or how I pronounced spaghetti as paschetti until I was 8. He did not know me. And I did not love him. Still, we stayed in touch. A few emails a month. The occasional phone call. He sent birthday cards to my children, who called him Grandpa James, with the curious warmth of children meeting someone new and deciding they liked them. It was enough. Not a fairy tale. Not a second chance. Just enough. And, meanwhile, had moved in with Evan and his family after a minor fall. She was in the early stages of dementia, her memories softening at the edges like an old photograph left in sunlight too long. I hadn't seen her in almost a year. The last time we spoke, I had told her I needed space. She had nodded like she understood, but something in her expression told me she believed time would fix what truth had broken. It didn't. Still, I visited. One Saturday morning, I brought a pie, apple, her favorite, and knocked gently on Evan's door. He answered with surprise and a guarded warmth that told me our rift had never fully healed but that time had dulled its sharpest edges. "She's having a good day," he said, and led me to her room. She was sitting in a rocking chair, humming a hymn I hadn't heard since childhood. When she saw me, her face lit up, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if she recognized me or was simply glad for company. Then she whispered, "My little girl," and burst into tears. I knelt beside her, resting my hand on hers. "Hi, Mom," I said. "It's me." She apologized again. And again. And again. I didn't stop her. I just listened. For once, I didn't need her to make sense. I didn't need clarity or confession or explanation. I just needed the moment, a small patch of honesty in a garden of lies, where I could remember that even broken people are capable of love. Months passed. The air grew colder. Life returned to its rhythms, school drop-offs, dinner parties, holidays. But something inside me had shifted. I began writing again, not for work or obligation, but for myself. One afternoon, I sat down with a leather-bound journal and began to write a letter to my children, not for now, but for some distant future when they might question who they are, or where they come from, or whether truth and love can live in the same story. I told them everything. About Richard. About Anne. About James. About the years of silence, the bitterness, the letter, and the healing that followed. I told them that secrets do not protect people, they imprison them. And that no matter how complicated the truth may be, it's the only place where real connection can grow. I ended the letter with this: "You are mine, in every way that matters. I love you more than any truth can ever unravel. And I hope that when you face your own reckonings, you'll choose light over shadow. Every single time." That winter, I finally unpacked the last box from my childhood home, the one I had kept sealed in the attic for years. Inside, among old school ribbons and faded birthday cards, were 2 framed photographs. One of Richard, younger, smiling with sun in his eyes. One of Anne, holding baby me in her arms. I placed them side by side on the bookshelf in our living room. Not to pretend the story was simple. Not to say the pain had vanished. But to remind myself that love, even when fractured, even when born of deception or ended in silence, still counts. It always counts.